You hear the words literally every single day. Like you're scrolling through social media or you're chatting with a friend about a bad breakup, and suddenly someone is a narcissist.
Right. Or a psychopath.
Exactly. A terrible boss is a psychopath. An unpredictable ex
Uh-huh.
is borderline. I mean, we throw these terms around constantly in pop culture, mostly as a way to, you know, quickly categorize people who cause friction in our lives.
Well, it's incredibly comforting, isn't it? Having a neat little box to put someone in, especially when they're acting in ways we can't begin to understand. It provides this illusion of certainty.
Yeah, totally.
We inherently want to believe that human behavior, no matter how chaotic, can be perfectly sorted and labeled.
But when you actually step out of the comment section and dive into real clinical psychiatry, that neat little sorting system is, well, it's currently on fire.
It really is.
So today, for this deep dive, we are exploring the source material on the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders,
Yeah.
the DSM. Specifically, its famous personality disorder clusters A, B, and C.
Which everyone thinks they understand, but the clinical reality is so different.
Right. So our mission today is to cut through the internet jargon, figure out how these personality disorders are grouped, understand the, frankly, surprising history behind these boxes, and discover why the world's leading psychiatrists are currently tearing this exact system to the ground.
It's a huge shift in the field.
Okay, let's unpack this, because before we can truly analyze the flaws in this system, we really need to understand why it was built in the first place, right?
Yeah, context is everything here.
And looking at the sources, that takes us back to this massive paradigm shift in 1980.
Yeah, the publication of DSM-3 in 1980 by the American Psychiatric Association. I mean, it was nothing short of a revolution in psychiatric nosology.
Nosology being how we classify diseases.
Right, exactly. And to grasp the magnitude of this shift, you kind of have to look at the landscape of the 1960s and 70s.
Which was very Freudian, right?
Very. Earlier manuals like DSM-I and DSM-2 were steeped entirely in psychoanalytic language. The field was just dominated by these Freudian concepts.
So everything was about the unconscious.
Exactly. Diagnoses were described through the lens of unconscious conflicts, defense mechanisms, unresolved developmental stages.
Reading the source material on that era, I mean, it sounds less like a medical manual and way more like literary analysis.
So that's a great way to put it.
Because you could have two highly trained clinicians look at the exact same patient, but, because one doctor is super focused on an unresolved edible complex and the other is fixated on some different unconscious defense mechanism, they arrive at wildly different diagnoses.
The reliability was abysmal. I mean, it was a full-blown crisis of legitimacy for the profession.
Wow.
Because think about it, if doctors can't agree on a diagnosis, they certainly cannot agree on a treatment.
Right. That's a massive problem.
So, under the leadership of psychiatrist Robert Spitzer, the DSM's third task force took this radical turn. They drew really heavily on what's called the Feiner criteria from 1972 and the work of the St. Louis School of Psychiatry.
That was Eli Robbins and Samuel Goose, right?
Yes, exactly. And this group basically championed a strictly atheoretical, checklist-based approach.
Atheoretical meaning they didn't care about the underlying theory of why it was happening.
Right. They stopped trying to guess the unconscious motive.
It's like they essentially stopped trying to interpret the poem and just decided to write a diagnostic manual for a car.
Oh, I love that analogy.
You just observe the criteria, you count how many of those observable symptoms are met, and if they hit, 5 out of 9 checkboxes, boom, they get the diagnosis. No guessing the invisible cause.
And a major component of this new structured system was the introduction of multi-axial diagnosis.
Right, axis A and axis the second.
Right. So they took personality disorders, which they defined as these pervasive, inflexible, enduring patterns of inner experience and behavior that deviate from culture and cause impairment, and they placed them on their own distinct axis, which was known as axis the second.
And the reasoning behind isolating them on axis second in the sources is honestly fascinating. It was basically a clinical guardrail, right, to prevent overshadowing.
Exactly. Because if a patient comes into an ER with, say, severe acute schizophrenia or a major depressive episode.
Which lived on axis 4.
Right, axis 4. The clinician's immediate focus is obviously going to be stabilizing that acute crisis. So the creators of DSM-3 worried that doctors would completely ignore the underlying chronic personality structure of the patient.
Axis to second essentially forced them to pay attention to the foundation of the house, not just the fact that the roof was currently on fire.
Precisely. which naturally leads to the problem of organization. The task force had this list of 10 recognized personality disorders, and to make the manual digestible for clinicians and med students, they had to group them somehow.
Right, you need a system.
So they ended up sorting these 10 disorders into 3 buckets, which we now know as clusters A, B, and C.
But the sources reveal a really glaring detail about this grouping. This tripartite system, these 3 clusters, it wasn't the result of rigorous biological mapping
Not at all.
or even statistical factor analysis. It was heavily influenced by a theorist named Theodore Millon, whose ideas were just kind of prominent among the task force at the time. And it was ultimately adopted as an administrative filing system.
Yeah, it was a filing cabinet.
They just loosely organized the disorders based on which axis eye conditions they kind of superficially resembled, mostly just to make teaching them easier. So it was this practical necessity basically disguised as a scientific breakthrough.
And what's fascinating here is that the DSM itself has actually spent over 4 decades quietly disclaiming its own cluster system.
Oh, really? In the book?
Yes.
Yeah.
Right there in the text, since 1980, the manual has included caveats acknowledging that this specific clustering has, quote, not been consistently validated.
That is wild. The very manual that birthed the system whispers in the footnotes that it might not be scientifically real.
Yeah.
Yet because this administrative filing system has dictated medical training and insurance billing and clinical practice for 40 years, we really need to look at what's actually inside these categories.
We do.
And since you, listening right now, likely already know the dictionary definitions of things like narcissism or paranoia, we're going to bypass the basic traits and focus on the real clinical friction points.
Let's do it.
Let's start with cluster A, traditionally labeled the odd and eccentric cluster. This includes paranoid, schizoid, and schizotypal personality disorders.
Right. And while the cluster system was born of, administrative convenience, cluster A actually provides some of the strongest evidence for a biological anchor in personality pathology.
Okay, how so?
Well, if we look at the Danish-American adoption studies, which were initiated in 1968 by Seymour Kitty and David Rosenthal, we see this brilliant demonstration of biology at work.
The methodology of that 1968 study is incredible because it perfectly isolates the variables. So Keaty and Rosenthal utilized the Danish national registries, right, to track the biological relatives of adoptees who had been diagnosed with schizophrenia.
Exactly. By focusing on adoptees, they effectively severed the environmental variable. These biological relatives were raised in entirely separate households, meaning any shared traits could not be attributed to, mimicking behaviors learned at home.
Oh.
And the researchers found that these biological relatives, even though they never developed full-blown schizophrenia themselves, they exhibited highly elevated rates of what we now classify as schizotypal personality traits.
Things like magical thinking, eccentric behavior, intense social deficit.
Exactly.
So it proves that cluster A isn't just an arbitrary collection of, quirky behaviors.
Yeah.
It tracks a very real, heritable biological spectrum.
Yes.
It's genetically tethered to the schizophrenia spectrum.
Yes.
There's an actual biological joint being carved there.
But as we move from the genetic clarity of cluster A to the disorders that basically monopolize our cultural conversation, the boundaries become much, much more complicated.
Enter cluster B.
Enter cluster B, the, quote, dramatic, emotional, or erratic cluster, encompassing antisocial, borderline, histrionic, and narcissistic personality disorders.
This is the cluster that fuels the true crime genre and just endless internet analysis.
Oh, absolutely.
But the clinical reality in the sources is way more nuanced than the pop culture caricatures. Like, take borderline personality disorder, characterized by intense instability, chronic emptiness, and just an absolute terror of abandonment.
Right.
For decades, the psychiatric establishment largely viewed BPD as notoriously intractable, like you just couldn't fix it.
Right.
But the sources highlight a monumental breakthrough in the late 1980s with a psychologist named Marshall Linehan.
Yes. Linehan's development of dialectical behavior therapy, or DBT, completely upended the narrative that borderline was untreatable.
It's a fascinating approach.
What makes DBT so clinically brilliant is its mechanism. Linehan actually drew on her own profound lived experience with severe emotional dysregulation, and she recognized that traditional cognitive behavioral therapy,
Which is all about changing your thoughts.
right, which focuses relentlessly on changing thoughts and behaviors, she realized that often felt deeply invalidating to BPD patients, which led them to just drop out of treatment.
So she integrated the concept of dialectics, right? The idea of holding two seemingly opposing truths at the exact same time.
Yes, beautifully said. The therapy balances radical, Zen-like acceptance of the patient exactly as they are in this current moment, with the unwavering requirement that they must actively change their destructive behaviors.
That synthesis of acceptance and change.
Right. It became the first highly effective treatment for significantly reducing suicidal behavior in this population. It transformed the prognosis for borderline patients completely.
That's incredible.
Now, regarding another heavyweight in cluster B, antisocial personality disorder, we really need to address a persistent clinical friction point here.
Oh, this is a massive one. Because when the general public or even the media talks about a psychopath, they assume they're talking about antisocial personality disorder, or ASPD. But the literature makes it very, very clear.
Yeah.
They are not the same thing.
They overlap, sure, but the diagnostic architecture is fundamentally different.
How so?
Well, the DSM's criteria for antisocial personality disorder are heavily behavioral. The checklist focuses on a documented history of rule-breaking, criminality, impulsivity, conduct problems, starting in childhood. It basically asks, what has this person done?
Okay, the external actions.
Exactly. Psychopathy, conversely, is typically measured by tools like Robert Hare's Psychopathy Checklist Revised or the PCLR. Hare's model heavily emphasizes internal affective traits. It asks, who is this person internally?
So, wait, someone could meet the criteria for antisocial personality disorder
Wrong.
simply because they, I don't know, grew up in a highly volatile environment, joined a gang, got into physical fights, and repeatedly broke the law just to survive.
Yeah.
They hit all the behavioral check boxes. But if you actually sit them down and measure their internal affective traits, they might still possess the capacity for loyalty or genuine remorse or empathy for their inner circle.
Precisely. They do not have that cold, glib, calculating, and fundamentally callous internal structure that defines a true psychopath under Hare's criteria.
Wow, that's a huge
Yeah.
distinction.
It is. The DSM opted for behavioral criteria because, remember the 1980 shift? Behaviors are easier to reliably observe and count.
Right, the checklist.
But in doing so, they created a diagnostic category that captures a lot of aggressive rule breakers who are not actual psychopaths.
Which perfectly illustrates the limitations of a rigid checklist, honestly.
It really does.
Now, contrasting with the outward drama of Cluster B is the final grouping. Cluster C, the anxious and fearful disorders. This includes avoidant, dependent, and obsessive-compulsive personality disorder, or OCPD.
And here we find another crucial distinction that trips up a lot of people. OCPD is not the same as obsessive-compulsive disorder, or OCD.
Right, the acronyms are so similar.
They are, but they occupy entirely different chapters in the diagnostic manual, and the psychological mechanisms driving them are distinct.
The clinical phrasing in the source material for this is so helpful. It describes OCD as ego-dystonic, like a computer virus. The person experiencing the intrusive thoughts with the compulsion to, like, flick a light switch 10 times, they know it's irrational.
Yeah.
They're distressed by it, they don't want the thoughts there, and they're fighting the virus. OCD, on the other hand, is egosyntonic. It's the operating system itself.
That is an excellent way to conceptualize it. Egosyntonic. The rigid perfectionism, the absolute need for interpersonal control, the obsession with rules and lists. The person with OCPD does not view these as distressing symptoms to be cured.
Right, they think it's a feature, not a bug.
Exactly. They view them as vital tools for navigating a chaotic world. They actually believe their impossibly high standards are exactly how the world should operate. And they think the real problem is that everyone else is just sloppy and undisciplined.
It's a completely different worldview.
Yeah.
And Bridget Grant's NESARC study, the National Epidemiologic Survey on Alcohol and Related Conditions, revealed something staggering about these particular operating systems.
Yes, the prevalence data.
That massive study found that roughly 9 to 15% of U.S. adults meet the criteria for at least one personality disorder in their lifetime.
Which is huge.
But the real shocker is that this prevalence is heavily concentrated in Cluster C.
Yeah. Despite receiving a fraction of the research funding and almost zero media attention compared to, the dramatic cluster B disorders, the anxious and fearful disorders are actually the most prevalent in the general population.
So we have a system where up to 15% of the population fits into these boxes.
Yeah.
And it has been the global standard for diagnosis since 1980. On paper, it sounds robust, but the deeper you read into the contemporary research, the more you realize the entire foundation is just crumbling.
It's falling apart. The clinical reality has simply refused to conform to the neat little boxes the task force designed.
Right.
Which brings us to the core scientific debate in psychiatric nosology over the last 20 years, the categorical versus the dimensional approach.
Okay, break that down.
So, categorical asks, do personality disorders carve nature at its joints, creating discrete, mutually exclusive diseases? Like, a patient either has leukemia or they don't. Or is personality pathology dimensional? Continuous, like blood pressure, where everyone has a reading and it's just a matter of how high the dial is turned.
And the strongest evidence destroying the categorical box model is the sheer scale of the comorbidity problem.
Absolutely.
Researchers like Mark Zimmerman have consistently demonstrated that patients rarely fit into just one box. If a patient meets the diagnostic criteria for one personality disorder, the statistical probability is incredibly high that they will meet the criteria for a second or even a third.
And critically, that second diagnosis is very often in an entirely different cluster.
Okay, let me push back on the clinical significance of that, though.
Sure.
If I go to the emergency room, I can have a severe respiratory virus, and I can also have a fractured femur. They don't combine into a new super disease. They're just two distinct pathological processes happening at the same time in the same body.
Right.
So why does having dependent traits from cluster C and borderline traits from cluster B simultaneously invalidate the cluster system?
It is a logical question, but the physical medicine analogy fails when applied to the structure of the psyche.
Okay.
Because with a virus and a fracture, we can point to two completely independent, distinct mechanisms, a pathogen and a physical trauma. But personality disorders are not invading pathogens. They are descriptions of the integrated, holistic self.
I see.
Prominent critics in the field, like John Leavesley and Thomas Wiedeger, argue that this massive cross-cluster overlap proves the boundaries themselves are illusions.
Not real walls.
Exactly. If clusters A, B, and C represented genuinely separate underlying psychological structures, the overlap should happen almost exclusively within the clusters. But the clinical data shows symptoms just bleeding indiscriminately across all boundaries.
Which explains one of the most damning statistics in the sources. Because actual human beings are so messy and rarely present as textbook cases of just one isolated disorder, the single most frequently assigned access to second diagnosis in many clinical samples became personality disorder not otherwise specified.
Yeah, PD-AOS. When your most common clinical conclusion is essentially a formalized shoulder shrug, it is a glaring indicator that your diagnostic map does not accurately reflect the territory of human suffering.
Wow. And beyond the scientific validity, the categorical system has also faced intense scrutiny regarding bias.
Yes.
Let's look at the gender bias studies from the 1990s, conducted by researchers like Marshall Becker and Sharon Lamb. They designed these experimental studies where they presented clinicians with written case vignettes.
Right.
The symptoms, the behavioral history, the dialogue, everything was identical. The only variable they altered was the stated gender of the fictional patient.
This raises an important question about how societal expectations and cultural conditioning inevitably bleed into medical observation.
Because the results of these vignette studies were stark.
Very.
When a case described erratic, volatile, and emotionally aggressive behavior, clinicians were significantly more likely to assign an antisocial personality disorder diagnosis if the name at the top of the file was male.
But if they read the exact same behavioral description with a female name on the file, they overwhelmingly pivoted and diagnosed borderline personality disorder.
It's the same symptoms?
Exactly. The data forces the field to grapple with how much of diagnosis is objective observation and how much is just clinicians interpreting rule-breaking in men as antisocial and rule-breaking in women as emotional instability.
And this historical baggage is particularly evident with histrionic personality disorder.
Yes.
Its conceptual lineage traces directly back to hysteria, a sweeping diagnosis heavily popularized by Jean-Martin Charcot in 19th century Paris.
Oh, Charcot's hysteria.
Right. Hysteria has a long, well-documented history of medicalizing and pathologizing traits that society coded as overly feminine. And contemporary critics argue that the modern criteria for histrionic personality disorder still disproportionately capture socially typical female emotional expression rather than representing a distinct fundamental psychological defect.
And it is really crucial to note that the field remains fiercely divided on this.
Absolutely. To be clear, we are not taking a side here. We are just reporting the debate from the sources.
Next.
Some researchers argue these differing diagnostic rates reflect genuine, underlying biological sex differences in how certain pathological traits manifest.
While others maintain it is entirely the result of ingrained clinician bias.
Oh, right. We're simply highlighting that these rigid boxes are highly susceptible to cultural gravity.
Yes. And because of these massive comorbidity overlaps, the over-reliance on the not otherwise specified label and the ongoing debates over structural bias, the global psychiatric community is currently executing a massive pivot.
They're finally abandoning the boxes.
They are. The paradigm is shifting away from rigid paint-by-numbers categories toward a dimensional model.
And we can actually see the bridge to this new world in the DSM-5, which was published in 2013. While they kept the traditional clusters in the main text basically to avoid totally disrupting clinical, billing, and legal precedents overnight, they introduced the alternative model for personality disorders, or the AMPD, in Section 3.
And the AMPD completely ditches the clusters. Instead, it evaluates individuals on a continuum, scoring them across 5 broad trait domains: negative affectivity, detachment, antagonism, disinhibition, and psychoticism.
Which essentially mirrors the big 5 personality traits used in general psychology, right? Openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism.
Exactly.
So instead of forcing a clinician to declare whether a patient is definitively in or out of a rigid box, the dimensional model acts like a mixing board in a recording studio. Everyone has the exact same set of dials.
Yeah.
A personality disorder only occurs when specific dials, like negative affectivity or antagonism, are pushed all the way into the red, distorting the output.
It's a much more elegant way to capture human complexity, and the World Health Organization has taken this logic even further.
Oh, right, with the ICD-11.
Yes, the International Classification of Diseases, which went into effect in 2022. They effectively deleted the specific categories and the cluster system altogether. Influential figures in the field, like Peter Tyrer, really championed this move toward a streamlined dimensional approach.
So what's the diagnosis now?
Under the ICD-11, there is now essentially a single diagnosis: personality disorder.
Wow. You just diagnose the presence of personality dysfunction, and then you rate it purely by severity: mild, moderate, or severe, adding optional trait domain qualifiers to paint a specific picture of the patient's struggles.
Yes.
The old A, B, and C filing cabinets have literally been hauled out to the dumpster by the international standard.
And they really have.
So what does this all mean? Why should you, listening right now, care about the internal bureaucratic battles of psychiatric manuals? Well, because these diagnostic labels carry staggering real-world stakes. They do not just exist in textbooks. They dictate the trajectory of human lives.
The ramifications are profound. I mean, in the criminal justice system, an antisocial diagnosis or a high psychopathy score on the PCLR can literally be the deciding factor in court sentencing, or the denial of parole, or even indefinite civil commitment.
That's huge.
In family law, a clinician slapping a borderline or narcissistic label on a parent during a bitter divorce can completely dictate who retains custody of a child. And on a practical level, insurance reimbursement and disability benefits literally hinge on which specific code a doctor inputs into the system.
And beyond the legal and financial stakes, there is the devastating cultural stigma. There's this pervasive misconception that having a personality disorder means someone is just fundamentally broken, inherently toxic, and utterly untreatable.
Which is just false.
Right. Rigorous long-term data proves that is a total myth.
Yes. We can look at Mary Zanarini's landmark collaborative longitudinal personality disorder study.
Okay.
By tracking patients over extensive periods, Zanarini's research definitively proved that within a 10-year follow-up window, a vast majority of patients diagnosed with borderline personality disorder actually achieve remission.
Wow. Meaning they no longer met the full diagnostic criteria.
Exactly. Personalities are not fixed in stone. People can and do adapt, heal, and learn new ways of navigating their inner world, especially when given access to targeted, evidence-based therapies like DBT.
And we also have to remember the quiet sufferers in all of this.
Mm-hmm.
We obsess over the loud, dramatic cases in Cluster B, but millions of people are trapped in the quiet desperation of Cluster C.
The anxious cluster.
Right. The chronically anxious perfectionist with OCPD who works themselves to the bone but feels entirely empty.
Oh.
Or the person with dependent personality disorder who genuinely believes they cannot survive on their own and remains trapped in an abusive relationship.
Yeah.
They are the statistical majority, and this evolving diagnostic framework dictates whether they are seen, understood, and actually treated.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we are witnessing a monumental shift in how science understands human nature. We're finally moving past Robert Spitzer's 1980 checklist revolution.
We've come a long way.
We've toured the odd, the dramatic, and the anxious clusters and recognized their limitations. And by adopting a dimensional model, psychiatry is finally acknowledging that personality pathology is not a collection of discrete, isolated diseases, but a complex, interconnected spectrum.
We are all operating on that exact same mixing board, which leaves us with a final, deeply provocative thought to mull over as the international community adopts this new ICD-11 severity model.
Okay.
If personality disorders are no longer considered completely separate diseases, but merely the extreme ends of normal human traits on a sliding scale, at what exact click of the dial does a personality officially cross the threshold into a disorder?
That is the question.
Is that line fundamentally drawn by our underlying biology? Or when we get right down to it, is that line simply determined by how much friction society is willing to tolerate? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the architecture of personality. Keep questioning the labels, keep exploring the nuances, and we will catch you next time.